Welcome, my friends. I am Dr. John H. Watson, and it is a distinct pleasure to have you join me by the fire this evening. The tale I have to share with you tonight concerns a bespoke piece of furniture that seemingly swallowed a man whole, an architectural impossibility that masked a crime of chilling ingenuity. Before I begin my record of this peculiar affair, I would be delighted to know a little more about my companions for the evening. From which city are you listening as my words reach you? And if you would be so kind as to indulge an old soldier, what is your favourite Sherlock Holmes story from the chronicles I have published thus far? You can leave your answers wherever you are listening. Pour yourself a restorative measure, settle into your armchair, and let us return to Baker Street. It was a bitterly cold evening in late November, the sort of night where the London fog tasted of damp soot and river mud. Outside, the glowing halos of the street gas lamps struggled to pierce the gloom, and the distant clatter of a passing hansom cab on the cobblestones was entirely muffled by the heavy mist. Inside our sitting room at Baker Street, however, the hearth fire roared, casting a ruddy, cheerful glow against the patterned wallpaper. I sat in my customary armchair, a heavy ledger balanced upon my knees, sorting through a formidable stack of old medical bills. The faint, dry scent of aging parchment mingled with the sharp, acidic tang of the chemical compounds boiling gently in a glass retort on the opposite side of the room. My friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, was draped over the sofa in a posture of extreme languor, his eyes closed, his breathing so incredibly shallow he might have been a corpse waiting for the undertaker. He had not spoken a single word since we had returned from a rather tedious consultation with a Scotland Yard inspector concerning a trifling forgery at the Diogenes Club, having plunged immediately into one of those dark, brooding lethargies that so often followed mental exertion. I was just adding a lengthy column of shillings, my silver nib scratching rhythmically against the paper, when the domestic quiet of our sanctuary was violently shattered. A heavy street door below slammed with a force that rattled the window panes in their wooden frames. Footsteps clattered up the stairs, stumbling, frantic, and entirely lacking the measured, polite tread of our landlady. I heard Mrs. Hudson issue a sharp, indignant cry of protest from the landing, but her warning came entirely too late. The door to our sitting room was thrown wide open, striking the wall with a sharp crack that caused me to drop my pen. A young man stood in the threshold, swaying unsteadily as if he had just endured a severe physical blow. From a purely medical perspective, his condition was deeply alarming. His face was entirely devoid of healthy colour, presenting a waxy, bloodless mask that caused his dilated pupils to appear like dark, bottomless pits. His breath tore through his throat in ragged, uneven gasps, and a fine, uncontrollable tremor racked his broad shoulders. He wore a heavy canvas apron, generously coated in fine yellow wood dust, and his large, raw-boned hands clutched the painted doorframe as though it were the only solid thing left in a dissolving universe. Holmes did not open his eyes. He merely shifted his dark head a fraction of an inch against the velvet sofa cushion. "You are tracking a considerable amount of sawdust into our Persian rug, my good fellow," Holmes observed, his voice entirely devoid of inflection or surprise. "A rather fine grade of Honduran mahogany, if the scent reaches my nose correctly. Pray, close the door behind you. The draught from the stairwell is interfering with the steady flame of my Bunsen burner." The young man gave a violent start, staring at my companion as if the detective were a practitioner of the dark arts. He stumbled forward into the room, allowing the door to click shut behind him, and collapsed heavily into the empty wooden chair I immediately indicated for him. I crossed the room to the sideboard, poured a generous measure of brandy from the crystal decanter, and pressed the glass into his shivering hands. He drank the amber liquid in a single ungraceful gulp, coughing violently as the strong spirit burned its way down his throat, bringing a faint, sickly flush back to his pale cheeks. "I am Arthur," the young man stammered, his voice cracking with untested youth and profound shock. "Arthur Vance. I am the senior apprentice to Elias Thorne, the master cabinetmaker in Spitalfields. You must help me, Mr. Holmes. He's gone. The devil has taken him right before my eyes, or else the cursed wood itself has eaten him alive." I leaned forward in my chair, my professional interest thoroughly piqued by the absolute, unvarnished sincerity in the boy's terror. "Men do not simply vanish into woodwork, Arthur," I said gently, attempting to project the calm, steadying authority I so often utilized with frightened patients in my consulting room. "Compose yourself. Tell us exactly what has happened, and omit no detail, however trivial or nonsensical it might seem to you at this moment." Arthur wiped his mouth with the back of a heavily calloused hand. I noticed his fingernails were deeply stained with dark varnishes and linseed oil, the indelible marks of a man who worked intimately with timber. "Mr. Thorne is a genius, sir," Arthur began, his breathing slowing marginally. "He is widely considered the finest craftsman in all of London. For the past 3 months, he has been labouring day and night over a private commission for a wealthy gentleman from the continent. It is a magnificent, imposing writing desk, built of solid black walnut and heavy brass, containing more secret compartments, false bottoms and hidden latches in a secure bank vault. We were working late tonight in the shop, attempting to finish the final polish. The rain was coming down terribly hard on the tin roof, making a deafening racket. Mr. Thorne was crouched on the floor, fitting the bottom drawer of the right-hand pedestal. It was a perfectly standard drawer, Mr. Holmes, no more than 2 feet deep. I swear this to you on my mother's life. I helped cut the dovetail joints for that very drawer myself yesterday afternoon." The apprentice squeezed his eyes shut, his face twisting in genuine agony as if trying to physically block out a waking nightmare. "Thorne dropped a small brass fitting," Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a harsh, trembling whisper. "It rolled towards the back of that bottom drawer. He reached in to retrieve it. I was standing no more than 5 paces away, sweeping the floorboards. I watched him plunge his right arm into the drawer, but his arm kept going, past the elbow, past the shoulder. He leaned forward, pushing his head and his torso into a wooden cavity that could not possibly exist in the natural world. The drawer was merely 2 feet deep, yet half of his body was entirely swallowed by the shadows within it. He gave a muffled, echoing shout, a sound somewhere between profound surprise and pure animal terror, and then a great pulling force seemed to take him from within. He was violently yanked forward. His heavy leather boots left the workshop floor, kicking wildly in the empty air, and then he simply slid forward into the dark belly of the desk. He was gone. I ran to the furniture. I grabbed the brass handles and pulled the drawer entirely out of the wooden carcass. It was empty. The back of the desk was solid, unyielding wood. There was no trapdoor, no pit in the floor beneath it, no secret exit. Just an empty 2-foot wooden drawer, and my master completely vanished from the face of the earth. Holmes finally opened his eyes. The oppressive lethargy had vanished completely from his wiry frame, replaced instantly by the coiled electric energy of a predator scenting fresh blood on the wind. He swung his long legs off the sofa and sat upright, his sharp aquiline features suddenly animated with intense piercing calculation. "You immediately checked the floorboards beneath the desk," Holmes stated, framing the sentence as an absolute fact rather than a question. "Yes, sir," Arthur replied eagerly, leaning forward. "Solid oak planks nailed incredibly tight. No seams, no hinges, no hollow sounds when I struck them with my heavy mallet. And the back panel of the desk itself?" Holmes inquired, his grey eyes narrowing. "Solid walnut," Arthur said firmly. "I hammered the panel in myself yesterday morning. There is no physical way out of that wooden box." Holmes steepled his long thin fingers beneath his chin, his gaze resting intently upon the dancing flames of the hearth. "You have allowed the suddenness of the event and the gloomy atmosphere of a rainy night to blind your innate reason, Mr. Vance. The supernatural is merely the refuge of the lazy mind. Ghosts do not commission bespoke furniture from Spitalfields, nor do demons care for dropped brass fittings. Matter cannot be created out of nothing, nor can it be destroyed, and a fully grown man certainly cannot be compressed into a 2-foot mahogany drawer unless he has been previously put through an industrial meat grinder." I watched my friend closely, noting the familiar, dangerous spark dancing in his steely eyes. "You believe it to be an elaborate mechanical trick, Holmes?" "Holmes," I asked, recognizing the precise direction his extraordinary mind was taking. "Of course it is a trick, Watson," Holmes replied swiftly, rising from the sofa and beginning to pace the length of the sitting room. "And a remarkably sophisticated one, designed to capitalize on the exact dimensions of the cabinetmaker's workshop, the limitations of human perspective and the very architecture of the desk itself. A drawer that appears 2 feet deep, but actively accommodates a human body, is an illusion crafted through the clever application of angled mirrors, sliding false panels, and a concealed connection to a secondary hidden space. The fact that the apprentice here built the drawer, and the solid backing himself, merely proves that the master cabinet maker meticulously altered his own apprentice's work in secret after the shop was closed. Thorne engineered the exact parameters of his own miraculous disappearance. Arthur shook his head vigorously, his panic returning in a fresh, desperate wave. But why would he ever do such a thing? He was an honest, hard-working man entirely devoted to his craft. He had no gambling debts, no bitter enemies, no secret vices that I knew of. He rarely spoke to anyone but his wealthy clients. Holmes stopped pacing. He stood perfectly still in the centre of the room, his profile illuminated by the firelight, casting a long, sharp shadow against the wall. He turned slowly toward the young apprentice, his expression hardening into something exceptionally cold and entirely unforgiving. A man does not dedicate 3 months of his life to building a mechanical drawer of infinite depth merely to hide himself, Watson, Holmes said, his voice dropping to a low, chilling timbre that seemed to lower the temperature of the entire room. He builds it to safely and permanently dispose of a human corpse, and I fear Mr. Thorne has just become the first tragic demonstration of his own murderous machine. Chapter 2. The Hormorganesian. The Airhogany. The air in the workshop was heavy with the scent of dried linseed oil, ancient sawdust, and the unmistakable metallic tang of stale sweat. I stood near the doorway, letting my eyes adjust to the gloom. The solitary gas lamp sputtering on the brick wall cast long trembling shadows across the floorboards. It was a cold room, the chill of the London damp seeping through the brickwork and settling in my joints. I observed the space with the practiced eye of a former army surgeon assessing a triage tent. There was a profound absence of life here, an unnatural stillness that suggested a sudden, violent interruption rather than a peaceful departure. Tools lay scattered on the workbench. A chisel had rolled to the very edge, arrested only by a splinter in the wood. A half-empty cup of tea had grown a pale skin of mould. The craftsman had not intended to leave. In the centre of this suspended life sat the mahogany desk. It was an imposing piece of furniture, dark and heavy, with brass fittings that gleamed dully in the low light. To the casual observer, it was merely a fine example of Victorian craftsmanship, perhaps a trifle bulky for a modern study, but elegant in its proportions. Yet, as I approached it, the optical illusion began to assert itself. The lower right drawer, pulled out to its full extension, seemed to vanish into a shadowed abyss that entirely defied the external dimensions of the piece. I walked around to the rear of the desk, measuring the depth with my eye. The back panel was solid wood, perhaps an inch thick. From front to back, the desk measured no more than 3 feet. The drawer, however, appeared to stretch into a blackened void far exceeding that measurement. It was an affront to geometry. Holmes was entirely oblivious to my pacing. He had shed his ulster and was kneeling on the dusty floorboards, his face mere inches from the lower woodwork. His posture was that of a hound that had just caught the scent. His breathing was shallow and rhythmic. He did not touch the desk immediately. He simply looked, his sharp grey eyes darting over the grain of the mahogany, the alignment of the brass handles, and the subtle accumulation of dust in the crevices. I watched his right hand hovering over the floor, his long, pale fingers tracing the invisible lines of construction. "You see the joinery, Watson," Holmes said, his voice quiet and entirely devoid of inflection. "It appears standard enough," I replied, stepping closer, mortise and tenon securely glued. "A master carpenter's work. Look at the dust," he instructed. I knelt beside him. The floorboards were coated in the thick, even layer of grey workshop grime. However, directly beneath the right side of the desk, the dust was disturbed. It was not a footprint, nor was it the sweep of a broom. It was a subtle fan pattern, a slight clearing of the particulate matter, as if a heavy current of air had been repeatedly exhaled from beneath the woodwork. "I see it," I said. "A draught from below?" "A mechanism, Watson. Wood breathes, but it does not sigh." Holmes finally placed his hands upon the desk. He did not pull the drawer. Instead, he gripped the vertical partition separating the drawers from the knee-hole. He applied pressure, not forward or backward, but upward and to the left. For a moment, nothing happened. Then there was a sound. It was not a loud click, but a deep, resonant thud, like a stone dropping into a well. The entire interior panel of the lower right section detached itself, sliding smoothly backward on oiled internal runners. The impossible depth of the drawer was suddenly explained, though the reality was far more disturbing than a mere optical trick. The false back of the desk concealed an opening in the floorboards upon which the piece had been precisely positioned. The drawer itself had no back panel. It was merely a wooden frame that, when fully extended, served as a disguised chute leading directly down into the darkness beneath the workshop. I fetched the dark lantern from my bag, struck a match, and directed the concentrated beam of light down into the aperture. The chute was narrow, constructed of rough-hewn pine boards that contrasted sharply with the polished mahogany above. It descended vertically for about 10 feet before angling sharply toward the cellar level of the building. The air that rose from the hole was foul smelling of river mud, stagnant water, and the sharp coppery scent of dried blood. I leaned over the opening, my medical instincts immediately engaged. The edges of the pine boards were not smooth. About 3 feet down, illuminated by the harsh glare of the lantern, I observed several deep gouges in the wood. I pointed them out to Holmes. "Fingernails," I said, feeling a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the damp room. Holmes leaned over my shoulder. "And boots," he added. He was right. Below the parallel scratches of desperate fingers, the wood was heavily scuffed by leather soles. Someone had gone down this chute, and they had not gone willingly. They had braced themselves against the narrow walls, fighting the descent with every ounce of their strength. I reached down into the opening, carefully extending my arm to retrieve a small anomaly caught on a jagged splinter near the fingernail marks. I brought it up to the light. It was a tiny scrap of fabric, no larger than a postage stamp, but its texture was unmistakable. "Fine worsted wool," I noted, rubbing the material between my thumb and forefinger. "High quality. A gentleman's trouser leg, perhaps a charcoal grey. The force required to tear this against a mere splinter suggests a violent downward drag. The victim was wearing garments ill-suited for a carpenter's workshop." "Excellent, Watson," Holmes murmured. His eyes were not on the fabric, but on the underside of the desk's false back. He reached up into the dark cavity where the hidden mechanism housed itself. I heard the rustle of stiff paper. Holmes withdrew a small rectangular volume. It was a ledger bound in cheap black leather, its edges curled and stained with moisture. It had been wedged between the runners of the false back, a desperate hiding place chosen in haste. The book was secured with a thin brass clasp which Holmes broke with a flick of his thumb. He opened the ledger under the beam of my lantern. The pages were filled with a cramped, precise handwriting, executed in dark iron gall ink. There were no dates, no clear descriptions of goods sold, and no financial sums. Instead, the pages contained lists of names, addresses, and architectural measurements. I read the names as Holmes slowly turned the pages. Lord Henry Blackwood, Eaton Square. Sir Thomas Rotherham, Pall Mall. Lady Eleanor Sterling, Kensington Gore. The list continued, spanning 3 pages, reading like a register of the most prominent, wealthy, and influential figures in London society. Beside each name were numbers, 36 by 24 by 48, the exact dimensions of a standard, heavy study desk. "These are clients," I said, looking at the scattering of tools around us. Our missing carpenter was supplying furniture to the highest echelons of the city. Holmes did not answer immediately. He turned to the final page containing writing. Here, the precise handwriting devolved into a frantic, jagged scrawl. The ink was smeared, suggesting it had been written in absolute terror or extreme haste. There were no names on this page. There was only a single, repeated phrase, written over and over until the pen had torn through the cheap paper. "They are hungry. They are hungry. They are hungry. They are hungry." I felt my pulse quicken at the sight of the madman's scrawl. The absolute break in the writer's mental state was evident in the chaotic strokes, the heavy pressure applied to the nib, and the total abandonment of the margins. It was the writing of a man who knew his end was imminent. "A terrifying enterprise, Watson," Holmes said softly, closing the ledger with a snap that echoed in the silent workshop. He stood up, his face pale and set in lines of grim calculation. He looked down at the dark, oaken chute, and then at the ledger in his hand. "I do not understand, Holmes. Why construct such an elaborate trapped door beneath a desk? And why hide the ledger?" Holmes walked slowly around the mahogany desk, his eyes tracing its elegant lines, its polished brass, its veneer of utter respectability. "Consider the mechanism, Watson. The desk does not merely conceal the chute. The desk is the mouth of the chute. The drawer is pulled, the mechanism engages, the floor opens. An individual sitting at this desk, leaning forward to retrieve a document from the depths of the lower drawer, would find their center of gravity fatally compromised." I stared at him, the horrifying mechanics of the trap suddenly becoming clear in my mind. A sudden tilt, a loss of balance, and the victim would plunge headfirst into the dark. "But this desk remains here," I argued, gesturing to the heavy mahogany piece. "It is a prototype, a staging ground." Holmes turned his gaze toward me, his eyes dark and entirely humourless. "Exactly, Watson. This is merely the workshop, the prototype, the testing ground for the trap." He held out the black leather ledger, tapping his finger against the list of the most powerful people in London. "The true terror of this room is not the drop beneath our feet, Watson. It is the realization that over the past 6 months, 24 identical mahogany desks have been delivered to 24 separate homes across this city, and we do not know what sleeps at the bottom of their drawers." Chapter 3. The skirts in the varnish. The damp chill of a London autumn seeped through the floorboards of our handsome cab as we rattled over the cobblestones of Oxford Street. Beside me, Sherlock Holmes sat in profound silence, his sharp profile illuminated intermittently by the sickly yellow glow of passing gas lamps. On his knees rested the leather-bound ledger we had recovered the previous night. His long pale fingers traced the columns of names and addresses with the methodical precision of a surgeon searching for a severed artery. The air inside the cab was thick with the scent of wet wool, damp newsprint, and the sharp bite of Holmes's shag tobacco. I watched him study the pages, noting the rigid set of his jaw. The list we had discovered was not merely a catalogue of transactions. It was a map of impending ruin. Our first destination was a towering townhouse in Mayfair, the residence of Sir Eustace Brecon, a man whose influence in the Home Office was matched only by the formidable wealth of his family. The butler who admitted us was a creature of practiced discretion, leading us through corridors heavily draped in velvet to a study on the first floor. As we entered, the atmosphere of the room struck me with the force of a physical blow. The air was stifling, overheated by a roaring grate, yet the man seated before the window shivered as if exposed to a winter gale. I observed Sir Eustace with a medical eye before a single word of introduction was exchanged. He possessed the hollow, waxen pallor of a man who had not slept in a fortnight. His breathing was shallow and rapid, the classic presentation of a nervous system stretched to the point of collapse. When he stood to receive us, his hands betrayed a fine, persistent tremor that he attempted to mask by gripping the lapels of his smoking jacket. The man was drowning in terror. Holmes declined the offer of a chair. He stood near the centre of the room, his eyes sweeping over the heavy drapes, the Persian rug, and finally settling upon the magnificent mahogany desk that dominated the space. It was identical in craftsmanship to the one we had examined the day before. Sir Eustace demanded the reason for our intrusion, his voice thin and strained. Holmes did not answer immediately. He stepped toward the desk, trailing a finger along its polished edge. Then he turned, locking his piercing grey eyes onto the government official. He stated plainly that Sir Eustace was paying a blackmailer. He added that the payments had begun exactly 3 weeks ago, shortly after the delivery of the desk, and that the demands were increasing. The effect of these words was instantaneous and dreadful. Sir Eustace collapsed into his armchair, the last vestiges of colour draining from his face. He gasped for air, his hand fluttering to his chest. For a moment I feared he might suffer a cardiac event, and I stepped forward to loosen his collar. He waved me away with a trembling hand, staring at Holmes as if the detective were an apparition. Sir Eustace confessed in a broken whisper. He admitted that highly sensitive documents concerning naval expenditures had been compromised. He had brought the papers home to review in the strictest confidence, locking them in the central drawer of his new desk. He swore on his life that the lock had not been forced, the room had not been breached, and no servant possessed a key. Yet, 3 days later, a letter arrived containing an exact transcription of his private notes, accompanied by a demand for £500. Holmes knelt beside the heavy piece of furniture. I watched as he produced a small magnifying glass from his waistcoat pocket, his face hovering inches from the woodwork. He examined the brass fittings, the alignment of the drawers, and the dense grain of the mahogany. The scent of fresh varnish hung heavily in the confined space of the study, a cloying, chemical sweetness that masked the natural musk of old paper and leather. The secret of the desk was not immediately apparent even to my trained companion. Holmes withdrew the central drawer entirely, placing it upon the floor. He lay upon his back, sliding his head and shoulders into the cavity of the desk, illuminating the dark interior with a wax vesta. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the ragged breathing of Sir Eustace and the faint scratch of the match against the wood. When Holmes emerged, a grim smile played upon his thin lips. He instructed me to examine the underside of the writing surface. I took his place on the floor, holding the flickering match up to the wooden ceiling of the desk cavity. At first I saw nothing but flat, polished timber. Then, as the light shifted, I noticed a hairline fracture in the wood, running parallel to the edge. It was a false panel held in place by a mechanism of extraordinary subtlety. Holmes explained the device with a cold, terrifying admiration. The desk was a Trojan horse. It was not designed to protect the secrets of its owner, but to harvest them. The writing surface was fitted with a microscopic, spring-loaded trap beneath the leather blotter. Whenever a heavy document was placed upon it and pressed down by the act of writing or leaning, the false panel below would yield by a fraction of an inch. Holmes reached into the recess and triggered a hidden catch. A thin, flat tray descended silently. Resting within the tray was a sheet of specialized carbon paper positioned perfectly to capture the pressure of a pen moving across the surface above. It was an engineering marvel, utterly invisible from the outside, designed to duplicate every signature, every figure, and every intimate confession written upon the desk. Sir Eustace stared at the carbon sheet in mute horror. The realization that his most trusted piece of furniture was an active spy in his own home shattered his remaining composure. He buried his face in his hands, weeping softly into the silence of the study. Holmes showed no pity. He merely slipped the carbon sheet into his pocket, replaced the drawer, and strode toward the door, gesturing for me to follow. Over the next 4 hours, our hansom wove a ragged path through the wealthiest districts of London. We visited a shipping magnate in Belgravia, a prominent judge in Kensington, and a newly minted peer in Westminster. In every house, the pattern repeated with sickening precision. We found men in the grip of extreme psychological distress. We found identical mahogany desks, fresh with the scent of new varnish, and beneath every writing surface we found the same insidious mechanism, waiting patiently to betray its master. The shipping magnate had been blackmailed over a falsified manifest. The judge was bleeding his family fortune to suppress evidence of a youthful indiscretion he had documented in a private diary. The blackmailer was a phantom, leaving no tracks, making no physical contact, demanding payment through convoluted drops at crowded railway stations. The victims were paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the thefts. By the time we returned to the cobblestones of Baker Street, the sky had bruised into a deep, twilight purple. A cold drizzle had begun to fall, slicking the pavements and casting elongated, distorted reflections of the street lamps. I felt a profound weariness settle in my bones. As a medical man, I am no stranger to suffering, but the systematic, mechanized destruction of these lives filled me with a unique revulsion. We ascended the 17 steps to our sitting room in silence. Mrs. Gord, Hudson had kept the fire burning, and the warmth of the room was a welcome relief from the damp chill of the streets. Holmes did not remove his ulster or his deerstalker. He immediately approached his chemical table, sweeping aside a jumble of test tubes and retorts to make space for the items he had gathered. He laid out 4 sheets of the captured carbon paper, smoothing them down against the pine boards. Then, from the deep pocket of his coat, he produced a small, jagged splinter of wood he had extracted from the false panel of the judge's desk. He held the splinter up to the light of the gas lamp, turning it slowly between his thumb and forefinger. I stood beside the fire, warming my hands, observing the intense concentration radiating from his posture. I remarked that the criminal organization behind this scheme must be vast. To manufacture the desks, infiltrate the homes of the powerful, collect the hidden carbon sheets, and orchestrate the blackmail required a network of unprecedented coordination. The cabinetmaker, whose name appeared in the ledger, was undoubtedly the architect of the woodwork, but the mastermind directing the operation was a mind of a different caliber entirely. Holmes shook his head slowly. He stated that the collection of the carbon sheets was the fatal flaw in my reasoning. He pointed out that the homes we visited were heavily guarded. The studies were locked. No servant could routinely dismantle the desks to retrieve the hidden trays without risking discovery. The mechanism we had found was brilliant, that it required physical retrieval. The phantom had to enter the room. He brought the splinter of wood to his face, closing his eyes as he inhaled deeply. He handed the splinter to me, instructing me to smell the varnish. I held the jagged fragment to my nose. Beneath the sharp chemical odor of linseed oil and resin, there was an underlying scent. It was faint, organic, and deeply unpleasant. I recognized it instantly from my time in the surgical wards. It was the distinct metallic tang of dried blood. Holmes walked to the window, staring out into the rain-swept darkness of Baker Street. He spoke in a voice devoid of inflection, yet heavy with terrible implication. He explained that the desks were not visited by a collector in the dead of night. The varnish was applied thickly, not just to preserve the wood, but to conceal the scent of something mixed into the lacquer itself. He turned back to face me, his grey eyes catching the firelight. He stated that the final name in the ledger was not a client, but a destination. He pointed to the sheets of carbon paper on the table. When exposed to the heat of the fire, the black backing began to warp, revealing a faint, watermark-like impression stamped directly into the fabric of the paper. It was a crest belonging to a foreign embassy that had burned to the ground 3 days ago, taking all its secrets and its ambassador into the ashes. Holmes looked at the fire, a muscle clenching in his jaw, and asked aloud who stands to inherit a kingdom when the king's most intimate secrets are locked in a drawer that feeds directly to the flames. Chapter 4. The Rival's Malice. The nature of professional hatred is a subject I have long considered worthy of a dedicated medical treatise. In my years as an army surgeon and later in private practice, I have witnessed the destruction wrought by cholera, the ravages of consumption, and the blunt trauma of the battlefield. Yet none of these physical ailments erode the human constitution quite so thoroughly as absolute, consuming jealousy. A thief steals to satisfy a temporary need. A man driven by professional malice, however, seeks not merely to acquire, but to obliterate. He wishes to erase his rival from the earth. As our four-wheeler rattled over the slick, rain-washed cobblestones toward the artisan district of Clerkenwell, I found my thoughts returning to this grim reality. The case of the missing master cabinetmaker had led us away from the polished drawing rooms of our initial inquiry and down into the bitter, sawdust-choked underbelly of the London furniture trade. Sherlock Holmes sat opposite me, entirely still. His sharp profile was silhouetted against the pale yellow glow of the passing gas lamps. He had not spoken since we departed Baker Street, his mind clearly arranging the scattered fragments of the puzzle into a cohesive shape. His hands were clasped beneath his chin, his breathing slow and measured. When he finally broke the silence, his voice was crisp, devoid of any speculative hesitation. The local constabulary is undoubtedly focusing their meagre investigative powers on random footpads and highwaymen, Holmes remarked, his gaze fixed upon the fog-streaked window. Violence without motive is chaotic and messy, Watson. The disappearance of our cabinetmaker was surgical. It required a man who knew the victim, knew the trade, and harboured a grudge significant enough to warrant murder. It requires Elias Thorne. I recalled the name from the scattered correspondence we had examined the previous day. Thorne was a fellow tradesman, a man who had engaged in a vicious 3-year legal battle with the missing master of the rights to a specific interlocking gear mechanism. The courts had ruled against Thorne, leaving him financially ruined and publicly humiliated. It was a motive of devastating clarity. I asked Holmes if he believed Thorne possessed the physical capability to overwhelm a man of the master's substantial bulk. Holmes did not answer immediately. "Leverage, Watson," he said softly. "Both mechanical and psychological, it can fell the largest of men." We alighted in a narrow, muddy alleyway behind Curtain Road. The dense November fog had settled low over the rooftops, trapping the acrid smoke of the local manufactories down at street level. The air was foul, heavy with the sharp sting of boiling animal hide glue, raw turpentine, and the damp rot of the nearby Thames. We navigated the uneven pavement, dodging discarded timber and overflowing ash bins, until we reached a dilapidated brick structure. A faded wooden sign above the door bore the name of Elias Thorne. The interior of the workshop was cavernous and poorly lit. The atmosphere was choked with fine wood dust that danced in the weak beams of light piercing through the grimy clerestory windows. The floor was buried beneath a thick carpet of wood shavings. Standing at the centre of the room, hunched over a massive oak workbench, was the man himself. Thorne was driving a heavy steel plane along the edge of a timber plank. The sound was a harsh, rhythmic tearing that echoed off the brick walls. He did not stop when we entered, though the harsh jangle of the doorbell surely announced our arrival. I took the opportunity to observe him with a clinical eye. He was a man hollowed out by stress. His shoulders were uneven, the right side sitting significantly higher than the left, an anatomical adaptation born of decades spent forcing tools through dense wood. His skin was sallow, possessing a greyish pallor that spoke of poor circulation and sleepless nights. As he pushed the plane forward, I heard the distinct high-pitched wheeze in his upper chest. It was a chronic pulmonary irritation, the inevitable consequence of breathing airborne particulate without protection. Yet, beneath the illness and the fatigue, there was a tightly coiled, dangerous energy. His forearms were thickly corded with muscle, and his massive hands were stained dark with oil and tannins. He certainly possessed the physical strength required for violence. Holmes stepped forward into the dim light. He did not offer his hand or state a pleasant greeting. "I am Sherlock Holmes," he announced loudly over the scraping wood. "Dr. Watson and I are investigating the sudden disappearance of your greatest rival." The heavy plane stopped. Thorne slowly lifted his head. His eyes were deeply bloodshot, sunk within dark, bruised hollows. He glared at Holmes, his jaw rigid. "The Scotland Yard inspectors have already been here," Thorne said, his voice resembling grinding stones. "I have nothing further to add." He gripped the handle of his tool until his knuckles turned entirely white. He spat onto the sawdust. "The world is better off without a plagiarist and a thief." Holmes remained entirely unbothered by the display of hostility. He moved slowly around the perimeter of the workbench, his eyes darting across the scattered tools, the half-finished joints, and the ledgers piled haphazardly on a stool. "The police possess a singular lack of imagination," Holmes noted coolly. "They ask where you were during the daylight hours. I am far more interested in where you were on Tuesday evening, precisely between the hours of 10 and midnight." Thorne's chest expanded as he drew a sharp, angry breath. "I was exactly where I am standing right now," he sneered, "working to fulfill a commission that might keep my creditors at bay for another month. Prove otherwise." Holmes stopped pacing. He stood directly across the bench from Thorne. He pointed a long, pale finger at a row of intricate carving gouges hanging upon the back wall. "Those tools are covered in an undisturbed layer of fine dust, indicating they have not been touched in days." He then lowered his hand, directing my attention to Thorne's heavy leather boots. "The welt of your left boot is heavily caked with a distinct, yellowish clay mixed with finely crushed coal ash. This specific geological composition does not exist anywhere near the paved streets of Shoreditch. It is, however, the exact composition of the unpaved rear loading alley directly behind the missing master's workshop." Holmes took a step closer, locking eyes with the artisan. "Furthermore," he continued, observing the severe discoloration and swelling at the base of your right thumb, along with the defensive posturing of your right shoulder, I conclude that you struck a solid object, likely a heavy oak door, in a state of high agitation recently. You were in that alleyway on Tuesday night, Mr. Thorne. The silence that followed was immense. The ambient sounds of the city outside seemed to fade away entirely. I stepped laterally to my left, adjusting my stance to ensure I could intervene if Thorne lunged across the table. I watched the artisan's face. The belligerence, the arrogant defiance, crumbled instantly. It was not replaced by the sullen resignation of a guilty man. It was replaced by terror. His pupils dilated rapidly, and a cold sweat broke out across his brow, plastering his thinning hair to his forehead. His heavy hands began to tremble so violently that the steel plane rattled against the oak plank. Thorne collapsed onto a wooden stool behind him. He pressed his bruised hands over his face and drew a ragged, shuddering breath. "You were right," he whispered. "I went there. The bank sent a final notice of foreclosure that morning. I am going to lose my shop, my tools, my entire life. That stolen patent was the final nail. The rage took me. I marched through the fog, determined to break inside, confront him, and take back the schematics that belonged to me." "What time did you arrive at the rear door?" Holmes asked, his tone softening only a fraction. "A quarter to midnight," Thorne replied hollowly. "I heard the distant toll of the church bell through the fog." "Did you break the lock?" Thorne shook his head, dropping his hands to his lap. "I fully intended to smash the door inward. I stood in the cold mud, working myself into a fury, raising my shoulder to ram the timber. But before I could strike, I froze. I heard a noise from inside the locked shop. I watched Holmes closely. His posture remained rigid, but I recognized the predatory intensity in his eyes." "Describe the noise with absolute precision," Holmes instructed. Thorne swallowed hard. He looked around the dusty workshop as if verifying we were truly alone. It was not a voice. There was no argument, no cry for help, no sound of a struggle. It was a mechanical sound, but magnified to unnatural proportions. Thorne leaned forward, his breathing erratic. I heard the heavy groaning of stressed timber, followed by the rapid, sequential clicking of massive brass gears. It sounded as though the entire room was shifting, realigning itself like the internal tumblers of a gigantic vault. The noise built to a crescendo, a terrifying grinding of wood and metal, culminating in a single deafening slam that shook the brickwork against which I was leaning. Then, absolute silence. "What did you do next?" Holmes pressed. Panic gripped me. Thorne admitted, "I feared he had trapped himself in some new machinery or triggered a mechanism to destroy my blueprints. I threw my heavy shoulder against the door. I struck it repeatedly until the iron latch shattered. I burst into the shop, expecting to find him gloating, or perhaps crushed by his own elaborate creation." "And what did you find? An empty room," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. The gas lamps were extinguished. The moonlight through the skylight illuminated the center of the workshop. The master's grand mahogany desk sat untouched in the middle of the floor. There was no sign of the man. His coat still hung on the peg. His pipe sat cooling in its brass tray. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Was anything out of place? Thorne's breath hitched. He closed his eyes, clearly terrified by his own memory. The lower right drawer of the desk was pulled out to its full extension. I approached it cautiously. I assumed he had fled in a panic, leaving the drawer open in his haste to secure the blueprints. I walked over to the desk and looked down into the open compartment. I felt a sudden drop in my own internal temperature. As a medical man, I rely upon the observable, the tangible, the logical boundaries of the physical world. Yet the look upon Thorne's face belonged to a man who had stared into the abyss. The drawer had no bottom, Thorne stated, his eyes wide and unblinking. Where there should have been a shallow wooded floor resting upon standard runners, there was only a perfectly square vertical shaft descending into absolute, lightless depth. The inner walls of the shaft were lined with heavy brass tracks and polished iron gears. "I swear upon my life, Dr. O." Watson, a cold, foul draught was blowing steadily upward from the darkness inside that desk. It smelled of ancient, damp earth and raw copper. I stared down into that impossible void until my nerve broke. I fled the shop and never looked back. Holmes did not scoff. He did not dismiss the testimony as the hysterical delusion of a desperate mind. He simply turned away from Thorne and stared at the blank brick wall. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating, a drawer that defied the spatial reality of the desk that contained it. It was an architectural impossibility, an affront to the laws of physics. Holmes finally turned back. "Remain in your shop, Mr. Thorne. Speak of this to no one." We turned and walked toward the exit. As we stepped back out into the bitter cold of the alleyway, the heavy fog immediately wrapped around us. I felt profoundly unsettled. "Holmes," I said, matching his rapid stride, "do you truly believe the cabinetmaker built a passageway beneath his desk, or is Thorne merely spinning a fantastical lie to cover a brutal murder?" Holmes stopped beneath the weak halo of a street lamp. He reached slowly into his deep ulster pocket. He did not answer my question directly. Instead, he opened his gloved hand and held it under the light. Resting in his palm was a small, heavy object. It was a thick brass cogwheel, intricately milled. "I acquired this from Thorne's workbench while the man was overcome by his own terror," Holmes stated softly. He pointed to the deep grooves of the brass teeth. They were coated in a dark, viscous substance. "This is not animal glue, Watson, nor is it varnish. It is partially coagulated human blood." Holmes turned the gear in the light, his voice devoid of all warmth, and the milling of this gear is a flawless match to the metallic tracks we observed hidden inside the empty desk frame yesterday. Our missing master did not merely flee, nor was he murdered in any conventional sense. The evidence strongly suggests the man was consumed by his own terrifying creation, and Elias Thorne possesses a piece of the machine that devoured him. Chapter 5. The Severndigit. The fog had rolled up from the Thames, clinging to the damp cobbles of Rotherhithe and carrying with it the sour stench of tidal mud and rotting weed. As our hansom rattled to a halt before the high iron gates of Thorne and Company timber merchants, the atmosphere was oppressive, heavy with unvoiced dread. The yard within was a labyrinth of stacked pine and oak, towering like the monolithic ruins of some ancient civilization. A clutch of uniformed constables stood near a massive circular saw in the centre of the yard, their dark capes slick with the mist, their faces pale under the sputtering glare of a single gas lamp. Inspector Lestrade stepped away from the group as we approached. His usual ferret-like energy was subdued, replaced by a grimness that spoke of unsavoury business. He offered no greeting, only a sharp nod toward a canvas tarp spread across a mound of pale sawdust. Lestrade looked tired, the deep lines around his mouth accentuated by the harsh shadows. He explained that a night watchman had stumbled upon the gruesome artifact less than 2 hours ago. The yard had been locked, the gates secured, and yet the master of the yard, Elias Thorne, who had vanished so inexplicably 3 days prior, seemed to have met a violent end among his own machinery. Holmes said nothing. He walked past the inspector with the silent, predatory grace of a hound catching the scent. I followed, pulling my heavy coat tighter against the biting chill of the river wind. The smell of freshly cut timber was overwhelming here, sweet and resinous, but beneath it lay the unmistakable, metallic tang of blood. Lestrade pulled back the corner of the tarp. Lying on the rough burlap, surrounded by a dusting of crimson-stained sawdust, was a human finger. It was a stout digit, severed cleanly at the middle joint. A gold signet ring, deeply embedded in the swollen flesh, bore the unmistakable crest of the Thorne family. Lestrade stated flatly that this was proof enough of murder. The missing man had been brought here, mutilated, and likely disposed of in the river. I knelt beside the tarp, my medical instincts immediately superseding my revulsion. The cold dampness of the ground seeped through the knees of my trousers. I asked Lestrade for a lantern, and he obliged, holding the hissing gas jet closer to the macabre exhibit. The flesh was pale, possessing the waxy translucence of alabaster. The edges of the wound were jagged, the skin retracted from the exposed bone in a manner consistent with a traumatic amputation. I noted the bruising around the proximal phalanx, the dark purple lividity that suggested immense crushing pressure prior to the severing. It was a gruesome sight, one that spoke of a frantic struggle and a terrifying demise. I stood and brushed the sawdust from my trousers, informing Lestrade that the amputation was fresh, likely occurring within the last 12 hours, and that the sheer trauma would have induced severe shock and catastrophic blood loss. Holmes had been standing perfectly still, his sharp grey eyes darting across the scene. He looked at the saw, at the sawdust, at the scattered planks of wood, and finally at the severed digit on the burlap. He dropped to his knees, moving with startling suddenness. From his ulster pocket, he produced his silver-rimmed magnifying glass. For a long silent minute, he hovered over the finger, his face mere inches from the mutilated flesh. I could hear his rapid, shallow breathing, the only sound in the quiet yard save for the distant, mournful blast of the river horn. When Holmes finally spoke, his voice was unnervingly calm. He asked me to observe the state of the blood on the sawdust beneath the finger. I looked closely. The crimson patches were dark and clotted, sitting atop the wood flakes like heavy beads of wax. I told him it was normal coagulation for a severe wound at this temperature. Holmes shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the finger. He stated that a man suffering a traumatic amputation from a mechanized saw would bleed arterial sprays, coating the machinery, the wood, and the surrounding floor. Yet the heavy iron table of the saw was pristine. The blood was entirely localized to the handful of sawdust directly beneath the digit. Lestrade crossed his arms, his patience fraying. He suggested that the murderer had washed the machine and swept the yard. Holmes dismissed the idea instantly. He pointed to the fine layer of undisturbed dust on the gears of the saw. No water had touched the machine in weeks. The finger, Holmes declared, had been brought here already severed and placed upon a bed of pre-stained sawdust. I felt a cold prickle at the nape of my neck. I knelt again, looking at the wound with new eyes. Holmes instructed me to touch the flesh. I hesitated, then pressed my gloved index finger against the waxy skin. It was frigid, far colder than the ambient temperature of the damp yard. Furthermore, it possessed a rigid density that defied the natural progression of rigor mortis. I brought my hand closer to my face. Beneath the metallic smell of blood and the sweet pine resin, there was a sharp, clinical odor. Formalin. I looked up at Holmes, the realization crystallizing in my mind. The digit had been chemically preserved, kept on ice, and only recently thawed for this grisly theatrical display. It was a piece of anatomical refuse, carefully prepared and planted to manufacture a murder scene. Lestrade scoffed, pointing to the heavy gold ring. He argued that the ring belonged to Elias Thorne, custom-made and never removed. He demanded to know whose finger it was, if not the missing timber merchant's. Holmes rose to his feet in one fluid motion, slipping the magnifying glass back into his pocket. He told Lestrade to examine the calluses on the fingertips. A man who owned a timber yard, who dealt in rough planks and heavy machinery, would possess hands hardened by decades of manual labour. The skin of the severed finger, despite its swollen state, was smooth and unblemished, the skin of a clerk or a scholar, not a labourer. The ring, Holmes noted, had been forced onto the digit after death, the skin scraped and torn by the violent application of the undersized band. The silence that followed was profound. The constable shifted uneasily. Lestrade looked from the finger to Holmes, the colour draining from his face as the implications took hold. There had been no murder in the timber yard. There was no victim. It was a stage meticulously set to deceive the law. I asked Holmes what purpose this macabre pantomime could possibly serve. To fake one's own death with such elaborate and repulsive detail required access to a medical facility, a steady supply of anatomical specimens, and a mind possessing a truly chilling degree of calculation. Holmes turned his gaze toward the towering stacks of timber, his profile sharp against the fog. He stated that the desk drawer in Thorne's study, the one with the false depth we had examined the previous evening, was the key. We had assumed the hidden compartment was meant to conceal ledgers of debt or correspondence of a blackmail victim. We had been looking at the problem through the wrong lens. Thorne was not hiding his ruin, he was hiding his enterprise. Holmes began to pace, his long strides easing up the distance between the machinery and the timber stacks. He spoke in rapid, clipping sentences. Elias Thorne controlled the largest shipments of heavy oak and ironwood in London. His carts moved unimpeded through the city at all hours. His yard sat adjacent to the financial district, sharing a subterranean wall with the newly constructed vault of the Royal Mercantile Trust. A master of a timber yard could move tons of earth, conceal excavation equipment beneath mountains of sawdust, and transport stolen bullion within hollowed-out tree trunks without ever drawing a second glance from the authorities. The disappearance, Holmes explained, was the final act of a long gestating plan. By manufacturing his own grisly murder, Thorne ensured that the police would scour the river for a corpse, interrogate his rivals, and tie up their resources in a futile homicide investigation. The severed digit was a masterstroke of misdirection. It provided irrefutable proof of his demise, allowing him the necessary days of absolute freedom to complete his subterranean work and vanish with the spoils. He was not a man fleeing from shadows. He was a man who commanded them. Lestrade stammered, pointing out the impossibility of tunneling into the Royal Mercantile Trust without alerting the street patrols. Holmes stopped pacing. He stood before a massive stack of raw oak trunks, the bark still clinging to the immense circular flanks of wood. He pointed to the ground at the base of the stack. The sawdust here was thick, but it was not the pale yellow of fresh pine. It was dark, clumpy, and smelled distinctly of deep river clay. I stepped forward, the weight of the revelation settling heavily upon me. The timber yard was not merely a place of business. It was the staging ground for an unprecedented robbery. The missing master was currently beneath our feet, or perhaps already miles away, navigating the subterranean arteries of London with a fortune in gold. Holmes crouched by the dark soil, running a pinch of his between his long, pale fingers. He stared into the shadows between the massive timber stacks, where the damp darkness seemed to stretch infinitely downward. He brushed the soil from his hands and looked up at me, his eyes gleaming with a cold, fierce light. He murmured that the earth here was fresh, turned within the hour. The play was not yet finished, but the final curtain was descending. The question that remained, Holmes noted softly as he stared into the lightless gap between the heavy oak trunks, was whether the tunnels beneath us were built to serve as a grand escape route or an elaborate tomb for those foolish enough to follow. Chapter 6. The Architect of Decit. The fire in our Baker Street sitting room had burned down to a crumbling architecture of grey ash and dull red embers. The air was thick with the acrid bite of black shank tobacco, layered so heavily that the gas lamps cast pale, struggling halos against the gloom. Holmes had not slept in 3 days. He stood by the mantel, his gaunt frame wrapped in his mouse-coloured dressing gown, his eyes fixed on the empty space above the hearth. I sat in my armchair, watching the rhythmic drumming of his long, pale fingers against the seasoned wood. It was the only movement in a room that felt as though it had been holding its breath for hours. His skin was drawn tight across his cheekbones, carrying the waxy pallor of a man who had subsisted on nervous energy and sheer intellectual momentum. As a medical man, I noted the faint tremor in his hands and the shallow, rapid rise of his chest, sure signs of extreme exhaustion. Yet his gaze remained terrifyingly lucid, tracking unseen variables in the cold air. The blackmail, I ventured at last, breaking the heavy, suffocating silence. We have the letters in our possession. We have the names of the victims. Surely the matter is now ready to be handed over to Scotland Yard. Holmes did not turn. The blackmail is a tributary, Watson. We are looking for the river. He stepped away from the mantel and crossed to the central table. The surface was buried beneath a chaotic drift of telegraph intercepts, architectural drawings, and the heavy leather-bound ledger we had recovered from the cabinetmaker in Wapping. He placed his hands flat upon the scattered documents, his posture rigid. "Consider the mechanism of the custom desks," he said, his voice dropping to a dry, rattling rasp. "The endless depth of the drawers. The pneumatic seals that hiss when compressed. The precise weight distribution required to mask the false dimensions of the wood. These are not the works of an opportunistic extortionist looking to hide a few scandalous letters. They are the works of a master engineer. Blackmail is, at its heart, a pedestrian crime. It relies on basic human fear and correspondence. Why would a man build a marvel of mechanical engineering merely to hide a few compromising photographs? To ensure they are absolutely never found by the authorities, I suggested, though the argument felt weak even as I spoke it. A hollowed-out book serves that exact purpose for a fraction of the cost, Holmes countered instantly. No, Watson. The blackmail was a temporary necessity. It provided the working capital. Engineering on the scale we are observing requires vast sums of money for materials, silence, and skilled labor. The extortion was nothing more than a means of silent, untraceable fundraising. The true objective lies entirely elsewhere. He opened the heavy ledger. The sharp, damp smell of mildew and stale iron, gall ink, rose from the stiff parchment pages. His forefinger, stained with chemical reagents, traced down the long column of recorded sales. "Look closely at the buyers, Watson. Read them aloud to me." I leaned forward, squinting through the dim, smoky light of the gas lamp. "Barings Bank," I read, tracing the copper plate script. "The London and Westminster Bank. The discounting firm of Ever and Gurney. The National Provincial." The list went on across 2 pages, an unbroken catalogue representing the financial heart of the British Empire. "Every single custom desk with the pneumatic drop and the infinite drawer," Holmes said, his voice tight with suppressed excitement. "Sold exclusively to the chief clerks and senior managers of the major financial institutions in the City of London. Do you see the pattern emerging from the noise? They are all banks and counting houses," I said, stating the obvious surface connection. "They are significantly more than banks, Watson. They are the physical structures surrounding the greatest repository of sovereign wealth in the known world." Holmes swept the extraneous papers aside with a sudden violent motion, sending a flurry of telegrams fluttering to the carpet. He produced a large, tightly rolled ordnance map of London from beneath the debris and spread it flat across the table. He weighed down the stubbornly curling corners with whatever lay within reach: a brass inkwell, a heavy crystal decanter, my medical stethoscope, and a battered wooden humidor. The map was a highly detailed survey of the City of London, its narrow streets, ancient courts, and tight alleys rendered in intricate, microscopic cross-hatching. He opened a small tin of red drawing pins and pushed it across the table toward me. "Pin them, Watson. Every single location recorded in the ledger." I took the pins. The domed brass heads were cold against my thumb. I found the location of Barings Bank on Bishopsgate and pressed a pin through the thick paper, driving it deep into the oak table beneath. I moved to the London and Westminster on Loughborough, the National Provincial on Bishopsgate, the Counting House on Cornhill. One by one, I marked the locations where the custom desks had been delivered. The only sound in the room was the sharp, rhythmic puncture of paper and the scrape of the brass pins against the wood. When I had finished the task, I stepped back to observe my work. I am a soldier, and my eye is inherently trained to evaluate terrain in terms of tactical advantage and fortification. What lay before me on the table was not a random assortment of commercial deliveries. It was a deliberate, calculated siege line. The red pins formed a jagged ring, an imperfect but deliberate circle drawn directly through the densest, wealthiest square mile on Earth. Holmes produced a brass compass and a long wooden straightedge. His movements were swift and entirely without hesitation, driven by the absolute certainty of his deduction. He drew a sharp, dark pencil line connecting the pin on Loughborough to the pin on Lombard Street. He drew another from Cornhill to Princes Street. The graphite hissed against the heavy paper. He drew a dozen intersecting lines, connecting the coordinates of every desk to the others across the map. The lines did not meet in a single neat point, but they created a dense, heavily shaded polygon in the very center of the web. A geometric convergence of perfect, terrifying symmetry. Holmes lifted his pencil. He stood perfectly still, staring down at the darkened shape in the center of the intersecting lines. Threadneedle Street, I said, feeling a sudden, profound chill that had nothing whatsoever to do with the dying fire in the hearth. The Bank of England. Specifically, Holmes murmured, his eyes unblinking. The subterranean vault situated beneath the central courtyard. I looked from the shadowed map to Holmes. The sheer audacity of the concept entirely defied reason. You are suggesting they are attempting to rob the Bank of England? It is a fortress, Holmes. Sir John Soane designed those walls to be windowless and impregnable. The vaults are sunk deep into the London clay, encased in iron and stone. The Sovereign Guards detachment patrols the perimeter every single night with loaded rifles. It cannot be breached, which is exactly why one does not go through the heavy stone walls, Watson. One goes beneath them. He tapped the dark penciled polygon at the centre of the map. The blackmail funded the excavation. But digging a tunnel through the London clay completely blind, amidst a tangled labyrinth of ancient sewers, abandoned underground railways and buried rivers, is a mathematical impossibility. One cannot navigate deep beneath the earth without fixed reference points. A surveyor on the surface uses the stars and prominent landmarks. A subterranean engineer has nothing but darkness. If you dig blind, you inevitably drift. You miss your target by 50 yards and breach an active sewer line instead of a vault filled with gold bullion. Unless you have markers, I realized, the truth finally dawning on me with a profound sense of physical sickness. Precisely. Holmes leaned his weight over the table, his eyes burning with a cold, devastating fire. The desks. Consider the endless depth of the drawers and the strange pneumatic seals. They're not built to hide paper, Watson. They're acoustic sounding boards. Dropped into the floorboards of these surrounding banks, they create a perfect network of subterranean telegraphy. They transmit resonant frequencies deep into the dense clay. The engineers in the tunnel use highly sensitive seismographic instruments to listen for the vibrations. The desks guide them through the dark. They are triangulating their exact position beneath the Bank of England by listening to the heavy thud of the drawers being closed in the banks above them. The chilling elegance of the scheme left me completely speechless. It was a crime of pure, unadulterated mathematics and architectural genius. The very men who managed the surrounding banks, the most upstanding citizens of the financial district, were unwittingly guiding the thieves to the greatest prize in Europe every time they closed their desk drawers. We must alert the bank governor immediately, I said, moving urgently toward the door to retrieve my heavy coat and boots. We must summon Inspector Lestrade and have the perimeter secured. Holmes held up a single hand. The gesture was absolute and commanding. He remained bent over the table, his face mere inches from the map. Wait, Watson. Look at the geometry. Look closely at the distance between the perimeter pins and the center vault. I stepped back to the table and leaned in. The map was clearly marked with a tiny scale in the bottom corner. The deepest desks, providing the strongest acoustic signals, are located at London and Westminster and the National Provincial, Holmes said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. The distance from those 2 points to the central vault is precisely 240 yards. A crew of expert sappers, working in total silence, propping the tunnel with heavy timber to avoid surface subsidence and detection, can progress no more than 3 yards a day through that specific density of clay. I stood in the quiet room and did the mental arithmetic. 80 days. Holmes nodded slowly, the shadows playing across his hollowed features. He picked up the heavy ledger once again and turned back to the front page, running his stained finger along the meticulously recorded dates of delivery. The desks were delivered and installed in late January, Holmes said. He looked up at me. The air in our sitting room felt suddenly, dangerously thin. It was currently the second week of April. I felt the cold realization settle deep in my chest, heavy and immovable as lead. 80 days, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Holmes reached for his overcoat, his movements suddenly fluid and urgent. The timeline is not prospective, Watson. The geometry is already complete. The acoustic markers have served their purpose, and the digging is done. The tunnel is already finished. He stepped toward the door, pausing to look back at the table one last time. He picked up the wooden straightedge and laid it across the final intersection of pencil lines, placing it exactly over the perimeter wall of the Bank of England vault. His pale finger traced a tiny, almost invisible anomaly on the Ordnance Survey map, a small ventilation grate marked near the ancient foundation line. The blackmail was not just funding, Watson. It was brilliant, calculated misdirection. And if my calculations are correct, the true architect of this deceit is not preparing to breach the vault. He is already inside it. But there is one devastating variable missing from this entire equation. He looked at me, and the dark dread pooling in his eyes was something I had rarely seen in all our years together. What happens, Watson, when a subterranean space of that sheer volume is suddenly breached, and the external air pressure instantaneously drops the pneumatic seals of the massive vault doors? Chapter 7. The Richmond Levee. The wheels of our handsome cab cut a wet and steady path through the London sludge as we made our way toward Scotland Yard. The air inside the cramped carriage was sharp with the scent of damp wool, and the faint metallic tang of the Thames that seemed to permeate the city on such dreary afternoons. Holmes sat beside me in an unbroken silence, his profile a rigid silhouette against the passing gas lamps. His long, pale fingers rested lightly upon a brown paper parcel balanced precariously on his knees. I knew better than to interrupt his reverie. A man whose life hangs in the balance requires absolute precision, and Elias Thorne was currently residing in a cold cell under the darkest of judicial clouds. I watched the rhythmic rise and fall of Holmes's chest, noting the coiled energy that resided just beneath his calm exterior. He was a hound who had caught the scent, though to the untrained eye, he appeared entirely asleep. We arrived at the imposing stone edifice of the Metropolitan Police Headquarters, greeted by the echoing symphony of heavy bootsteps and the muffled, authoritative barks of sergeants directing constables. The corridors were choked with the smell of wet surge and anxiety. Inspector Lestrade received us in his narrow office on the second floor, a room thick with the stale odour of cheap pipe tobacco and the sharp bite of iron gall ink. Lestrade leaned back in his creaking wooden chair, his waistcoat unbuttoned, a look of smug satisfaction settling across his sharp, ferret-like features. A man who preferred the comfort of an obvious conclusion to the arduous labour of an intricate truth. Lestrade had already consigned Elias Thorne to the gallows in his own mind. "You are wasting your time, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade said, waving a stained hand toward a towering stack of ledgers. "We have the motive, we have the opportunity, and we have the physical evidence at the scene." Thorne's varnish was spilled across the floorboards. A chisel bearing his distinct artisan mark was wedged into the doorframe. The man is a cornered rat. Holmes opened his eyes slowly. "The evidence is a theatrical production designed entirely for your applause, Lestrade." "I beg your pardon," the inspector bristled, sitting up straight. The colour rose in his cheeks, a flush of indignation that I had seen precede many of his misguided arguments. Holmes did not raise his voice. He simply leaned forward and placed the brown paper parcel onto the centre of Lestrade's cluttered desk. He untied the twine with methodical care, letting the coarse paper fall away to reveal a pair of heavy leather working boots. They were severely scuffed, the thick soles caked with a dried yellowish substance. "Observe the boots Thorne was wearing at the time of his arrest," Holmes said. "Tell me what you see," Lestrade scoffed, refusing to look closely. "I see the boots of a murderer, hastily wiped, but still carrying the grime of the London streets." "They carry grime, certainly," Holmes replied, "but it is not the grime of London." I leaned closer, my medical training naturally drawing my eye to the physical reality of the object, rather than its emotional weight. I scrutinized the granular texture of the dried mood clinging to the welt and the heavy heel. It entirely lacked the oily black consistency of the macadamized city streets, which are forever soaked in soot and horse refuse. This substance was porous, brittle, and pale. As I brought my face nearer, I detected a faint, sweet scent of decaying riverweed and chalk. "It is remarkably pale, Holmes," I observed, "and there is a distinct reddish hue trapped within the instep. It looks remarkably like the soil one might find much further upriver." "Excellent, Watson," Holmes murmured. "Your eye improves daily. It is a highly specific, reddish-yellow clay mixed with river silt and crushed chalk. This precise geological composition does not exist anywhere near the victim's dwelling in Southwark, nor near Thorne's own workshop. It is found exclusively along a particular stretch of the riverbank in Richmond, specifically near the old abandoned boatyards where the limestone runoff meets the Thames." Lestrade crossed his arms unimpressed. "So the man took a stroll in Richmond earlier in the week. What does that prove?" "It does not erase his presence at the scene of the crime last night." "It proves everything, Lestrade, because the clay tells a chronological story," Holmes stated. He pointed a long declarative finger at the heel of the left boot. "Notice the layering. The Richmond clay forms the outermost crust. Beneath it is the mundane dust of Thorne's own workshop. There is no intermediate layer of London street mud. Furthermore, the Richmond clay is still marginally damp at its core, indicating it was gathered within the last 18 hours. Thorne did not go to Richmond earlier in the week. He was standing in the mud of the Richmond riverbank at the exact hour you believe he was murdering a man in Southwark. Lestrade's confident posture faltered, a slight tremor of uncertainty touching the corners of his mouth. A clever theory, Mr. Holmes, but a jury will not acquit a man based on the dampness of his footwear. I require absolute proof of his whereabouts. Holmes withdrew a small leather folio from his breast pocket. He opened it and extracted 3 rectangular slips of coarse, badly crumpled paper. He laid them flat upon the desk beside the boots. They were stained with the exact same yellowish clay and stamped heavily with the official black ink of the Richmond Turnpike Authority. "These," Holmes said softly, "are penalty slips for unpaid toll tickets." I examined the slips. They bore a scribbled signature and a timestamp. "Thorne is a man of erratic habits and chronic forgetfulness," Holmes continued. "Yesterday evening, drawn by a false summons regarding a rare shipment of mahogany, he rode a hired roan out to Richmond. He arrived at the toll gate in a torrential downpour at 9:45. We know this because he found himself entirely devoid of copper coins. The tollkeeper, a stubborn man by the name of Higgins, refused him passage. An argument ensued. Thorne, ever the combative artisan, forced his way through but was subsequently detained by the local constable on the opposite side of the bridge. He was issued these penalty slips in lieu of payment, signing them under protest. Holmes tapped the heavy black ink on the final slip. It was held at the Richmond Constabulary until precisely 1 in the morning, awaiting a local magistrate to verify his identity. The murder in Southwark occurred at 11 o'clock. Unless Elias Thorne possesses the ability to divide his physical form and travel 12 miles instantaneously, he is an innocent man. The silence in the narrow office was absolute. The ticking of the brass clock on Lestrade's mantel suddenly sounded terribly loud. The inspector stared at the penalty slips, the arrogant flush draining entirely from his face, replaced by the pale, sickly pallor of a man realizing he has built a house upon sand. "Then who was in Southwark?" Lestrade whispered, the bravado completely stripped from his voice. The varnish, the chisel, the witness who swore they saw a man in Thorne's heavy ulster coat fleeing the alleyway. "An impostor," I interjected, the sheer audacity of the scheme suddenly crystallizing in my mind. Someone who knew Thorne intimately. Someone who knew his tools, his habits, and his wardrobe. Holmes gave a short, sharp nod. The rogue cabinetmaker. He engineered the entire scene in Southwark to point directly and undeniably at Elias Thorne. He stole the spare chisel, spilled a varnish to leave a recognizable signature, and hired a vagrant of similar build to run past the witness in a stolen coat. It was a masterpiece of misdirection. Lestrade dragged a hand across his face, a gesture of profound weariness. He orchestrated the false summons as well, didn't he? Sent Thorne on a wild goose chase to Richmond just to get him out of the way. He did, Holmes agreed, but the cabinetmaker made a single, fatal miscalculation. He assumed Thorne would pay the toll and pass through unnoticed, a ghost in the night. He could not anticipate Thorne's lack of coin, his volatile temper, and the subsequent administrative trap that created an impenetrable alibi. I felt a profound sense of relief wash over me. Thorne was entirely clear. We had walked into the jaws of Scotland Yard and extracted an innocent man through pure, unadulterated reason. I looked to Holmes, expecting to see the familiar spark of triumph in his grey eyes, the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle neatly resolved. Instead, I saw only a chilling stillness. Holmes was staring past Lestrade, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window pane. His jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles stood out in sharp relief beneath his skin. "You will sign the release papers immediately, Lestrade," Holmes said, his voice entirely devoid of warmth. "Of course," the inspector mumbled, already reaching for his pen and a fresh sheet of paper. "We must begin the search for this rogue artisan at once. He is on the run." Holmes slowly placed his hands flat upon the desk. "He is not running, Lestrade." I looked at my friend, struck by the sudden drop in temperature in the room. "What do you mean, Holmes?" I asked. "His plot has failed. Thorne will be free within the hour. The cabinetmaker's deception is exposed. You look at the events, Watson, but you do not consider the dimension of the deceit," Holmes replied, his eyes finally shifting to meet mine. "Why go to such extraordinary lengths to frame a man for murder? Why not merely kill Thorne if you wished him gone? The cabinetmaker did not want Thorne dead. He wanted Thorne incarcerated. He needed Thorne removed from his workshop, entirely isolated by the police, for a specific, uninterrupted duration of time. To what end? I asked, a creeping sensation of dread beginning to take root in my chest. Holmes reached into the deep pocket of his overcoat. He slowly withdrew a heavy rusted iron mechanism. It resembled a complicated set of architect's calipers, but its arms were curved violently inward, ending in sharp, needle-like points. I found these discarded beneath the floorboards of the Southwark crime scene, Holmes said quietly. They are not designed to measure outward width. They are calibrated to measure inward depth, specifically the depth of a void. He set the sinister iron tool atop the Richmond toll tickets. The cabinetmaker did not frame Thorn out of vengeance, Watson. He framed him to buy time. Time to construct something that requires absolute silence and empty rooms. Thorn's arrest was merely a distraction to pull the police out the front door. I fear we have spent the entire afternoon proving an alibi, only to realize the true crime is currently being built inside the walls of the house we left unguarded. Chapter 8. The Vault of Shadows. The rhythmic clatter of our hansom cab against the cobblestones of Cheapside did little to mask the heavy silence hanging between Holmes and myself. The dense London fog pressed against the glass, an impenetrable grey shroud that seemed a fitting mirror for the labyrinthine complexities of our present pursuit. Holmes sat rigid on the leather bench, his profile sharply defined by the intermittent glow of passing street lamps. His hands were tented beneath his chin, his eyes unblinking and fixed on a reality far beyond the confines of our carriage. I watched the steady, shallow rise and fall of his chest, recognizing the physiological markers of a mind operating at its absolute zenith. I waited for him to speak. In my years of medical practice and military service, I had learned the value of allowing a process to complete itself without interference. The human brain, much like a complex mechanism of gears and springs, requires a precise sequence of movements to reach its conclusion. Finally, Holmes lowered his hands and turned his sharp, aquiline features toward me. The desk was a rehearsal, Watson, he said, his voice cutting through the damp chill of the cab. A masterclass in deception crafted in mahogany and brass, designed to test a theory of spatial manipulation. I leaned forward, the leather of the seat creaking beneath my weight. You referred to the false depth of the jaw, I replied. The physical impossibility of a space larger on the inside than the dimensions of its exterior casing. Precisely, Holmes stated. Ilias Thorn is not merely a cabinetmaker. He is an architect of illusion. The drawer relied upon a system of interlocking wooden sleeves, counterweights and hidden fulcrums. When drawn, the external casing remained stationary while the internal compartment shifted along a restless track, dropping a fraction of an inch to reveal an expanded cavity. It was mathematically flawless. But Thorn is a man of singular ambition. He does not build parlour tricks for wayward aristocrats. He builds access. Access to what, Holmes? The foundation of the empire, he answered. 10 years ago, the firm of Hemmings and Vance was contracted to reinforce the subterranean structural timbers beneath the eastern wing of the Bank of England. The soil near the Thames is notoriously unstable. Thorn was their chief carpenter. He spent 6 months in the absolute darkness beneath Threadneedle Street, shoring up the very walls that protect the National Bullion Reserve. A cold realization settled in my chest, a sensation not unlike the dread preceding an infantry charge. He built the drawer into the architecture of the bank itself, I said. Holmes gave a single sharp nod. He did not build a wall to protect the vault. He built a mechanism, a wooden and stone puzzle box on a colossal scale. Tonight he intends to open it. Our cab drew to a halt before the massive, windowless facade of the Bank of England. The structure loomed above us like an ancient fortress, its soot-stained stone entirely devoid of warmth or welcome. Standing near the heavily reinforced iron gates of the rear entrance was Inspector Lestrade. The Scotland Yard man looked profoundly uncomfortable. His coat collar was turned up against the biting wind, and he stamped his boots repeatedly on the flagstones to ward off the freezing temperature. His complexion was pallid, and his breath plumed in the frigid air. "Mr. Holmes," Lestrade said as we alighted from the cab, "I have secured the premises as you requested, though the bank governor was violently opposed to the intrusion. We have a dozen men stationed at the perimeter, but I must tell you, I have walked the perimeter of the bullion vault myself. There is a foot of solid iron and 2 feet of Norman stone between the corridor and the gold. A battalion of artillery could not breach it in a night, let alone a lone carpenter with a sack of tools. They do not need to breach the vault, Lestrade," Holmes replied, his tone devoid of impatience, but leaving no room for debate. The breach was installed a decade ago. We are merely here to witness its activation, lead the way to the substructure. We were met by a silent, broad-shouldered bank warden who carried a ring of iron keys the size of a man's head. He unlocked a heavy steel door set flush into the foundation, revealing a narrow descending stairwell of raw stone. As we began our descent, the environment underwent a profound transformation. The distant sounds of London traffic vanished entirely, replaced by the hollow, rhythmic echoing of our own footsteps. The air grew perceptibly thinner and carried a damp, heavy odour of lime mortar, stagnant water, and the distinct metallic tang of oxidized iron. We passed through 3 more iron-barred gates, descending deeper into the earth. The gaslight from the upper levels gave way to the harsh, focused beams of the bullseye lanterns carried by Lestrade and the warden. The walls here were a patchwork of architectural history. Victorian brickwork rested atop crude medieval masonry, which in turn sat upon massive, rough-hewn stones that likely predated the Norman conquest. It was a subterranean world forgotten by the city above, a place where time was measured only by the slow, inexorable weeping of moisture through the porous rock. My old Giselle bullet wound, a persistent souvenir of the Afghan campaign, began to throb in my shoulder. The biting dampness of the deep earth has a way of finding old injuries, waking them with a dull, insistent ache. I adjusted my posture, rolling my shoulder slightly, and focused my attention on our surroundings. We arrived at a blind corridor terminating in a solid wall of dressed stone. To our left lay the reinforced steel bulkhead of the main bullion reserve. To our right, a stack of rotting wooden crates filled with defunct, water-damaged ledger books from the previous century. "This is the exact coordinate," Holmes whispered, stepping close to the dressed stone wall. He ran his long, pale fingers over the mortar joints, his eyes tracing patterns invisible to the rest of us. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The mortar is not cement, but a mixture of crushed limestone and a pliable resin. It will not crack when the stones move. It will stretch." Lestrade looked at the solid wall with profound skepticism. "You are telling me this entire wall is a door, Mr. Holmes. I am telling you it is a drawer, Lestrade. Lestrade, and the cabinetmaker is coming to open it. Hide yourselves behind the ledger crates. Absolute silence, the ledger crates. Absolute silence is imperative." We took our positions in the narrow space behind the stacked wood and rotting paper. The smell of decaying parchment and thick, settling dust was overpowering, threatening to provoke a cough. I drew upon my military discipline, slowing my respiration, breathing shallowly through my nose to filter the particulate matter. "Extinguish the lanterns," Holmes ordered. Lestrade twisted the shutter of his lantern, and the warden did the same. We were instantly plunged into an absolute suffocating blackness. It was a darkness so complete that my eyes strained uselessly against it, creating phantom shapes in the void. In the absence of sight, my other senses grew acutely sharp. I heard the erratic, rapid breathing of Lestrade to my left betraying his nervous tension. I heard the slow, measured exhalations of Holmes to my right. Somewhere far down the corridor, a single drop of condensation fell from the vaulted ceiling to strike a puddle below, the sound echoing with startling clarity. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The physical toll of remaining motionless in the freezing, damp air was considerable. My extremities grew numb and the ache in my shoulder sharpened into a piercing pain. Yet, the psychological weight of the darkness was far more oppressive. We were buried alive beneath the greatest metropolis on Earth, waiting for a ghost to walk through a solid stone wall. Tension in such an environment is not built by sudden events. It is built by the agonizing prolongation of nothingness. It is the anticipation of the unnatural. Suddenly, the absolute silence was broken. It was not the heavy thud of a hammer or the scraping of a pry bar. It was a sound that defied the subterranean environment entirely. It was the smooth, meticulously oiled sound of wood sliding against wood, magnified to an industrial scale. A low, resonant vibration passed through the flagstones beneath my boots, travelling up through my legs. I held my breath. Beside me, I felt Holmes shift slightly, his posture tightening like a coiled spring. A mechanical clicking sequence began, precise and rhythmic, resembling the internal workings of a grandfather clock, but possessing a weight that shook the surrounding air. The sound of shifting mass grew louder, a deep, groaning friction of stone sliding against stone without a single crack of fracture. Elias Thorne was not breaking into the Bank of England, he was operating it. A vertical seam of absolute blackness in the wall before us suddenly fractured. revealing a razor-thin vertical sliver of extremely faint, pale light. It was not the yellow glow of a gas lamp or a lucifer match, but the sickly pale luminescence of a chemical phosphor. The heavy stone blocks were receding. They were moving inward, retreating into a cavity that architectural plans dictated could not exist. The wall folded upon itself, the resin-laced mortar stretching silently to accommodate the impossible geometry. Then the cold, stagnant air of the corridor changed direction. A sudden draft washed over my face. Holmes reached out in the dark, his hand gripping my forearm with startling vice-like strength. I felt the sudden, rigid tension in his muscles, a physical manifestation of an unexpected and alarming deduction. I leaned closer to him, smelling the sudden sharp metallic tang of sweat on his skin. "Watson," Holmes breathed, his voice barely a vibration in the freezing air, stripped of its usual clinical detachment. "Feel the draft. The air is not flowing outward from the breach. It is drawing inward, pulling into the vault from the corridor." I focused on the sensation. He was entirely correct. The chilling breeze was flowing past us, being sucked into the illuminated fracture in the stone. "Do you smell the earth, Watson?" Holmes continued, his grip on my arm tightening painfully. "It is not the smell of Thames clay or ancient stone. It is the distinct, acrid scent of freshly turned graveyard loam and concentrated quicklime. We have miscalculated the trajectory of the artisan's design. He has not built a doorway to empty the vault." Chapter 9. The Labrywesen thawed in the stone. The darkness of the study possessed a heavy, suffocating quality. It was a stagnant air, smelling faintly of old varnish, damp wool, and the bitter tang of coal smoke that had seeped through the window frames. Beside me, Sherlock Holmes was nothing more than a denser patch of shadow against the heavy velvet curtains. His breathing was so shallow as to be entirely imperceptible. I, however, found my own heart beating with a dull, rhythmic thud against my ribs. The heavy weight of my army revolver rested in my overcoat pocket, my fingers tracing the cold cross-hatching of its grip. We had sat in this profound silence for nearly 4 hours. The great house was utterly still, save for the occasional settling of its ancient timbers. Then the vibration began. It did not register upon the ear at first, but rather upon the nerves. A faint, rhythmic tremor travelled through the solid oak floorboards and up through the soles of my boots. I shifted my weight infinitesimally. A moment later, the sound followed. It was a measured scraping friction, like the gnawing of some immense subterranean rodent. It originated from beneath the very centre of the room, precisely where the grand mahogany desk had stood before Holmes and I had silently dragged it to the far corner. The scraping ceased. A hollow click echoed in the cavity below us. A faint rectangle of pale light appeared on the floor as a section of the parquetry was pushed upward from beneath. The light grew, casting long, distorted shadows across the ceiling. The floorboard hinged backward with a soft groan of stressed wood. A hand emerged, the skin pale and dusted white with plaster, followed by a dark sleeve, and finally the crown of a head. Holmes moved with the sudden, terrifying velocity of a coiled spring. A match flared with a sharp hiss, and instantly the blinding glare of the bull's-eye lantern slashed across the room. The intruder cried out, throwing an arm over his eyes. I was upon him in the same instant. I seized the collar of his rough canvas jacket and hauled him upward with all my strength. He struggled wildly, his boots kicking against the edges of the false floorboard, but he was off balance and half confined by the narrow aperture. I pinned him face down against the adjoining floor, pressing my knee firmly between his shoulder blades. The metallic click of my handcuffs echoed sharply in the sudden quiet as I secured his wrists. "Stand up," I commanded, hauling the man to his knees. Holmes adjusted the lantern, bailing the prisoner in a harsh circle of light. It was Elias Vance, the master cabinet-maker. His face was streaked with sweat and pulverized brick dust. His pupils were contracted to mere pinpricks in the glare, and his respiratory rate was exceedingly high, his chest heaving with short, desperate gasps. I noted the faint bluish pallor around his lips and the pronounced tremor in his hands. He was a man consumed by an absolute freezing terror. "I miscalculated the joist, Mr. Vance," Holmes said. His voice was entirely devoid of triumph. It was the clinical observation of a mathematician noting an error in an equation. Vance spat a curse, turning his face away from the light. "The trap is sprung, Watson," Holmes continued, turning his attention away from the man on the floor. He stepped toward the heavy mahogany desk we had moved earlier. "Bring the lantern closer. It is time we examined the true nature of this endless drawer." I guided the prisoner to a straight-backed chair, forcing him to sit. and carried the lantern to where Holmes stood. My friend pulled the central drawer of the desk open. It moved with silent, oiled precision. To the eye, it was an ordinary receptacle, perhaps 3 inches deep, lined with faded green baize. "Observe the back panel, Watson," Holmes said. He reached into the drawer, his long, sensitive fingers pressed against the rear corners. There was no visible catch, but I heard the faint engagement of a secondary mechanism. The back panel of the drawer did not merely drop. It slid downward and inward upon a set of brass tracks so fine they were practically invisible, revealing a dark void beyond. "An elegant piece of engineering," Holmes murmured, peering into the opening. "The illusion of endless depth is a matter of basic geometry and masterful joinery. The drawer itself is little more than a funnel. When the secondary catch is engaged, any object placed within it slides silently backward. But where does it go?" He closed the drawer and ran his hand down the massive, intricately carved front right leg of the desk. "The leg is hollow," Holmes stated. He knocked his knuckles against the wood. It produced a dull, unresonant sound. "Lined with lead and velvet, I should say, to deaden the noise of a falling object. The internal chute connects the back of the drawer to the base of this leg." I looked at the floor where Vance had emerged and back to the desk. The geometry of the deception suddenly became clear to me. "The leg rested precisely over the altered floorboard," I said. "Exactly, Watson." Holmes nodded once. The desk was bolted to the floor, ostensibly to prevent it from marring the parquetry, but in truth to ensure the chute remained perfectly aligned with the aperture Vance had cut through the ceiling of the cellar below. When the late Lord Blackwood placed his sensitive documents into what he believed was a secure, magically deep compartment, they merely slid down the velvet chute through the floor and dropped into a padded basket in the subterranean passage. Vance remained silent, glaring at the floorboards. "The timeline of the deception is equally precise," Holmes continued, pacing slowly around the desk. "Vance was commissioned to build and install this piece 6 months ago. He had unhindered access to the study during the renovations. That is when he cut the aperture in the floor and fashioned the false parquetry. For months, the desk operated normally. The secondary catch remained disengaged. The drawer held inkwells and stationery. Blackwood grew accustomed to it. He grew to trust it." Holmes stopped and looked down at the cabinetmaker. "Then came the night of the 14th, Holmes said, his voice dropping in pitch. "The night the naval treaty drafts were brought to this house. Someone with intimate knowledge of Blackwood's habits engaged the secondary catch earlier that afternoon. When Blackwood retired for the evening, he placed the drafts into the drawer. They fell through the floor. Vance, waiting in the darkness below, collected them and simply walked out through the adjoining coal cellar. A theft committed without a locked door ever being breached or a window forced. It was a flawless execution," I remarked, staring at the empty space beneath the floorboards. "The mechanical ingenuity is astonishing." "Ingenuity, Watson, is merely a tool," Holmes replied. He crouched by the open hole in the floor, shining the lantern down into the dusty cavity. "The passage of the documents is clear. The mechanism is understood. We have the carpenter who built the labyrinth. We have the hands that caught the falling papers." Holmes reached down into the dark space between the joists. His arm disappeared up to the elbow. I heard the rustle of heavy canvas. "But we must ask ourselves," Holmes said, his voice echoing slightly in the hollow space, "why Mr. Vance has returned tonight. The documents were stolen 3 days ago. The trap was successful. The property was secured. There is nothing left of value in this house for him to retrieve through his clever chute." Holmes withdrew his arm. In his hand he held a heavy, cylindrical object wrapped in oilcloth. It was the size of a large wine bottle, but its weight was clearly far greater. Lance let out a sharp, ragged breath. He lunged forward against his restraints, his chair scraping violently against the wood floor. But I caught his shoulder and held him fast. The man was trembling so violently that his teeth chattered. "I was not retrieving anything, Mr. Holmes," Vance whispered. His voice was cracked and thin, devoid of its previous defiance. "I swear to God, I did not come back to take anything out." Holmes did not look at the man. He placed the heavy cylinder carefully upon the undamaged surface of the mahogany desk. With precise, deliberate movements, he began to peel back the layers of dark oilcloth. A strong, pungent odor filled the room, overriding the scent of dust and coal smoke. It was a chemical smell, sharp and sweet, reminiscent of bitter almonds and burning sulfur. I stepped closer, feeling a sudden, inexplicable chill settle at the base of my spine. The object revealed was a canister of heavy brass, capped with a complex arrangement of glass vials and fine copper wiring. A small, rhythmic ticking emanated from its core, so faint it could only be heard in the absolute silence of the room. "If you did not come to take something out, Mr. Vance," Holmes murmured, staring intently at the brass surface, "then you were paid to put something in." Holmes leaned closer to the device, his profile stark against the lantern light. He lifted his magnifying glass, examining the delicate copper wires connected to the central glass vial. The ticking continued, steady and unyielding. "Watson," Holmes said softly, never taking his eyes from the mechanism, "the theft of the naval treaty was not the culmination of this plot. It was merely the preamble. I suggest you draw your weapon and stand very still. We are no longer investigating a robbery. We are sitting upon a very active fuse, and I fear the architect of this trap intends for us to be the final ashes within it." Chapter 10. The Final Polish. The wheels of our hansom cab scraped against the damp cobblestones of Baker Street, a harsh and grating sound that finally broke the heavy oppressive silence between us. It was past 3 in the morning when we ascended the 17 steps to our familiar sitting room. The fire had burned down to a low sullen red, casting faint shadows that seemed to pool in the corners of the room rather than dance upon the patterned wallpaper. Mrs. Hudson had left a tray of cold meats and a decanter of brandy upon the sideboard, but neither of us made a move toward it. I was profoundly weary, carrying an ache seated deep in my marrow that recalled the damp nights of the Afghan campaign. Holmes, however, possessed that terrifying nervous energy which always followed the successful conclusion of a dark business. He threw his Inverness cape over the back of a chair, his angular frame rigid as he went immediately to the mantelpiece to retrieve his Persian slipper and the dark, oily shag tobacco kept within it. I watched him pack his clay pipe with long, restless fingers. His pallor was striking in the dim light, the skin drawn tight over the sharp jut of his cheekbones. The chase had ended, the physical danger had passed, but the mental pursuit was still echoing through his complex brain. As a medical man, I have often observed the physiological toll of genius. The heart rate remains elevated, the pupils dilated, the mind refusing to relinquish the puzzle even when all the pieces have been laid bare upon the table. He struck a match against the grate. The sudden flare illuminated his aquiline profile for a brief second before settling into the steady, pulsing glow of the pipe bowl. The acrid smoke filled the air, a familiar and biting scent that somehow grounded the extraordinary and terrible events of the past 3 days. "It is a singular tragedy, Watson," he said at last, his voice cutting through the quiet room without any preliminary clearing of the throat. He did not look at me, but stared deep into the dying coals. To possess hands capable of such miracles, to hold a mind that comprehends the very geometry of the physical world, and to turn it toward the petty, sordid business of concealment and murder. I settled into my armchair, feeling the worn fabric yield to my weight. I thought of the desk, the monstrosity of mahogany and brass that sat at the center of the tragedy. Elias Thorne was no mere cabinet maker. He was an architect of shadows. I recalled the precise, bloodless perfection with which Thorne had constructed the false bottoms, the hidden spring locks, the drawers that opened into empty space, and those that triggered the release of the fatal vapor. There was no passion in his crime. There was only mechanics. He was a man who had stared too long into the hollow spaces between the joints of his own creations until the emptiness took root within his own soul. "He will hang, of course," I remarked quietly, listening to the soft tick of the mantel clock and the steady intake of my friend's breath. Holmes shook his head slowly, a thick plume of smoke escaping his lips to drift toward the plaster ceiling. "Not Elias Thorne," he replied. "The gallows are for men of passion, Watson, for those who kill out of rage or jealousy or desperate greed. Thorne operates on a different plane of existence entirely. I spoke with Inspector Lestrade before we left the yard. Thorne has been remanded to Broadmoor. The prison physicians examined him and found a mind so fractured, so entirely divorced from human empathy, that he could not be held responsible under the law. He considers himself a martyr to mathematical perfection." "Broadmoor," I repeated, feeling a sudden chill that the meagre fire could not dispel. "He will spend his days in a stone cell, stripped of his tools, stripped of his wood. For a man whose entire being was defined by what he could build, that is a punishment far worse than the rope." Holmes gave a solitary, decisive nod. "Indeed. Lestrade tells me Thorne has already begun running his fingers along the rough mortar of his cell, searching for a hidden latch that does not exist. He will spend the rest of his miserable life trying to unlock a solid stone wall. And what of Lord Blackwood, I asked, rising to pour myself a small measure of brandy at last. The amber liquid burned my throat, a welcome warmth against the lingering damp of the London night. The man whose greed commissioned the desk in the first instance. Blackwood is ruined, Holmes stated flatly. The ledgers we extracted from the deepest of Thorne's hidden compartments proved disastrous for him. Blackwood sought a desk that could swallow his financial treachery, a piece of furniture that would make his embezzlements vanish into thin air. He paid Thorne handsomely for the illusion of total security. He did not realize that Thorne was not building a safe, but a trap. Blackwood's reputation is entirely destroyed. He resigns his position in the House of Lords tomorrow morning. By Friday he will likely flee to the continent to avoid his creditors. A fitting end for a man who believed that wealth could purchase immunity from consequence. The silence stretched between us again, comfortable but laden with the heavy residue of the investigation. My mind turned to the dust-choked workshop in Spitalfields, to the chisels and saws arranged with terrifying precision, and finally to the boy, young Thomas, the apprentice who had polished the mahogany, who had swept the floors, entirely ignorant of the deadly mechanisms his master was assembling above his head. He had looked so terribly small when Scotland Yard arrived, his face smeared with sawdust and tears, his hands trembling as Lestrade clapped the heavy iron cuffs on Thorne's wrists. "It is a cruel world, Holmes," I observed, staring at the bottom of my glass. "That boy is left with nothing. His master disgraced, his apprenticeship dissolved, his name forever associated with a mechanism of murder. He will likely end up in the workhouse, or worse, on the streets of the East End. He has the hands of a craftsman, but the prospects of a beggar." Holmes turned away from the fire and looked at me, his grey eyes unusually bright in the gloom. "You consistently underestimate my capacity for foresight, Watson," he said softly. I confess I was taken aback. "Foresight?" I asked, setting my glass upon the side table. "What have you done?" Holmes tapped his pipe against the iron grate, knocking out the loose ash with a sharp, rhythmic sound. "A mind like Thorne's is a rare and dangerous aberration," he explained. "But a pair of honest, steady hands is the true foundation upon which our society rests." I observed young Thomas closely when we first entered the workshop. "Did you notice his posture, Watson? The way he stood. I recalled the boy's stance. Calling upon my years of medical observation. He favoured his left leg," I said. A slight curvature of the spine, likely from long hours hunched over a heavy workbench, and calluses on the palmar surface of the index and middle fingers, quite severe for a boy of his age. "Precisely," Holmes replied. "But did you observe the way he held the smoothing plane when we startled him? He did not drop it. He did not grip it by the handle like a weapon to defend himself. He cradled the wooden body of the tool, protecting the iron blade from striking the stone floor even as he recoiled in fear. That is an innate respect for the tool. That is the mark of a true artisan, entirely untainted by Thorne's madness." Holmes crossed the room to his own desk, pulling open a drawer. I could not help but wince slightly at the ordinary mechanical action, so thoroughly had Thorne corrupted the simple concept of sliding timber in my mind. Holmes produced a single folded sheet of telegraph paper. "I dispatched a message to my brother Mycroft this afternoon," he continued, holding the paper up to the fading light. "There is a master guildsman in South Kensington, a man who builds brass and wooden instruments for the Royal Observatory. He requires an apprentice with a delicate touch and a profound respect for precision. Mycroft has arranged for young Thomas to be transferred into his care this very morning. I have established a modest stipend, drawn from my own accounts, to ensure the boy's lodgings are secure until he reaches his majority." I stared at my friend, deeply moved by this quiet, uncharacteristic act of charity. Holmes so rarely allowed his fundamental humanity to break through the cold, calculating surface of his intellect. "You have saved him," I said quietly. Holmes waved his hand dismissively, his features tightening as they always did when confronted with overt sentimentality. "I have merely redirected a useful asset," he muttered, turning his back to me. "A good carpenter is far harder to find than a good detective, Watson. It would be a crime against logic to let such capable hands freeze in the gutters of Cheapside." With that, the subject was irrevocably closed. He would accept no further praise, nor would he allow the emotional weight of his action to linger in the room. He walked to the corner of the sitting room and lifted his Stradivarius from its velvet-lined case. He did not bother to tune the instrument. It was always perfectly pitched, a reflection of his own demanding and faultless nature. He raised the bow and brought it across the strings in a long, mournful drawl. The melody he chose was not one of his erratic improvised screeches, nor was it a cheerful piece of classical repertoire. It was a slow, haunting sonata, full of descending minor chords that seemed to weep into the still air of the room. The music spoke of empty spaces, of locked rooms, of brilliant minds trapped forever in the dark. I listened, as the pure notes wrapped around the scent of tobacco and dying embers. I felt the tension of the past days slowly drain from my muscles, replaced by a profound and heavy melancholy. The case of the endless desk was concluded. The innocent were protected, the guilty were imprisoned, and the greedy were brought to ruin. Yet, as the fire finally collapsed into a pile of grey ash, I could not shake the feeling that we had only scraped the veneer of a much deeper darkness. I sit now at my own desk, the gas lamp hissing softly beside my glass inkwell. The Baker Street sitting room is completely quiet, save for the rain that has begun to beat a steady drumming rhythm against the window panes. Holmes has retired to his chamber, the violin finally silent. I have recorded the facts of the matter exactly as they occurred, ensuring that Elias Thorne's terrible genius is documented in these pages not as a marvel, but as a dire warning. Yet, as I dip my pen into the ink for the final time, my eyes are drawn downward. I look at the brass handle of my own bottom drawer. It is a simple, ordinary thing, holding only spare parchment and old medical journals, but I find I cannot bring myself to open it. I pull my hand away, leaving the cool metal untouched, forever haunted by the thought of what hollow, endless depths a man might build into the very foundation of the things we trust.